Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy in my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now, to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I'm holding in my hand a book by Luke Burgis. It's called Wanting: The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life. And very interesting book. We're going to talk about why he wrote it and what it's about. So, Luke, thanks for coming.
Hey, Rich. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background and what was your inspiration to write the book, and then, we'll get into what it's about.
I'm an entrepreneur by experience, I guess you should say, not by education. I worked on Wall Street for a short period of time and left to go to California and enter the startup world. And I spent most of my 20s there, founded 4 companies, and had some success, had some failure. But I've always been a very curious entrepreneur. I read like crazy, not just business stuff, classic literature, philosophy, theology, you name it. I've always kind of reached beyond and been interested in ideas. And one of the thinkers that captured my imagination more than any other was a French academic named René Girard, who also happened to be the mentor of co-founder of PayPal, Peter Thiel, while he was at Stanford. And his ideas have sort of been circulated in Silicon Valley for a very long time. I actually didn't learn about René Girard from anybody in the startup world or in Silicon Valley. I learned about him from a priest, believe it or not. And so Girard's, well, it was a lot less cool when I realized that everybody in the Valley had already known who this guy was. But Girard's ideas explained a lot of my own experience in life as an entrepreneur, as somebody who kind of felt whiplash in terms of my goals and my lifestyle and what I wanted. I would want one thing one day, and then the next I'd kind of lose passion and then take a different direction. And Girard's main idea, his big idea, was the concept of mimetic desire, the idea that human beings don't desire totally spontaneously and independently, but that we desire by finding models, people around us, and imitating the desires of other people, usually without knowing it. So I stumbled on Girard's thinking, and that's just the entry point into his thought. He has a lot of implications of this for human conflict and violence, but that one particular insight opened my eyes to a lot of the forces that were driving me in my life that I wasn't privy to before I read Girard.
Well, I guess maybe you just gave an example of one. Like you said, you felt, I don't know, I guess maybe embarrassed or like, oh, how come I didn't know about Girard and everyone else in Silicon Valley did? So that maybe gave you a mimetic desire to learn more about him.
Yeah. This is a long time ago. This is right around the time when Twitter just launched. And we kind of live in that world now, right? Where it's like there's elements of FOMO, not just with experiences and activities, but also with knowledge. Like people are looking to see if anybody else has said something and thinkers come and go, just like fashion trends and ideas come and go. And Girard's insight really explains a lot of this.
Well, now that you're aware of it, what started changing in your life? What did you notice, or what how did this benefit you knowing this?
It gave me an awareness to not necessarily take all of my desires for granted, first of all. And I began to shed this hyper-individualistic, probably prideful idea of my own desires, that I know what I want and that I've arrived at these goals and my ideas and my lifestyle totally independently. So I kind of take a step back and I've created some distance where I can examine my desires. I can ask some questions about them, think about the origin of them, where they came from, what I'm really looking for. That's an important question. I think early in my startup days, I would have told you I want to change the world, but what does that even mean? I mean, it's just abstract, as everybody does in a sense. Everybody wants to do something positive. I mean, I would say these things, but deep down, I sort of deeply wanted to have a certain kind of, I guess I wanted to be known, as this innovator or this certain kind of an entrepreneur and have this financial freedom. A bunch of things where once I achieved some of them, I realized that they had left me very empty, and that the model of an entrepreneur, like this, Platonic form of what it means to be an entrepreneur that had been held up to me, was driving my decision making. And never had I once stepped back and thought seriously about, well, where do I want to be when I'm, 40 years old? I'm coming up on that now. I just had never asked that question. I think we can just get caught up in the day-to-day, week-to-week stuff and not think about where our desires are necessarily leading us.
So, in society, there are a lot of paths we could follow. There's the starving artist, there's the, successful entrepreneur, there's the person that I guess leads a spiritual life and renounces all earthly possessions. What does it do to people where, at least in their group, in their circumstance, the ideal is to be, let's say, a hard driving entrepreneur that never sleeps and, makes millions and builds a unicorn and stuff like that, versus being in another setting where, the drive is completely different. Just, get a good education, go work for a company and just have a regular life and, a regular house and stuff like that. How much are people influenced by the people around them and what they're told to aspire to?
We all exist in systems of desire. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is to just make us a little bit more aware of the systems of desire that we exist in. So sure, there's the hard driving, ambitious striver, work 80 hours a week and become a millionaire as soon as you can. That's one system of desire. And we just have to recognize that's a system of desire. I mean, there are other totally separate ones. Monks, people that live a monastic life, there's a system of desire, a very intentional one, in fact, guided by the rule of Benedict. And that's a system of desire too. So, these things are not good or bad, just knowing that we're a part of one, that there's an order to desires, and it's largely determined. The influence or the ways in which we move and the kind of goals that are made desirable to us are influenced by that system that we're in. I think the education system in the United States is another one. We've had certain goals for a long period of time, and nobody has really stopped to question them until very recently. So that's just one way to look at it, knowing that, and we move in and out of different ones. We have a family system of desire too. And as we grow, we adopt others and we come into contact with them, often without even knowing it. It could be in our industry, could be in our city. And becoming aware of that and the way that it's affecting us can help us set better goals. It can help us develop some self-possession where we can realize, I'm kind of going after this thing because I'm everybody's telling me that it's the thing that I should want without having really, taken the time to examine that. So mimetic desire is not a bad thing, that we can certainly use it in positive ways, right? When we're surrounded by people with virtues or with lifestyles and love and friends, things that we want. I mean, those can affect us in very positive ways. So in one sense, sometimes we can exit a system of desire that is making us miserable. And then we can sort of, be pulled into another one and surround ourselves with people that also affect us, but in ways that we've sort of accepted with some agency and said, yes, this is the one that I want to be in.
Well, what happens if you're part of an ecosystem? Let's say you're a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, but yet you're very religious and everyone else around you makes fun of that. And they're like, that's ridiculous. And what happens to you internally? Part of you is pulled in one direction, but another part of you rejects that life. And it's who you are, but do you get all twisted up or what happens to you?
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
That's a great example because I am one of those guys. I was a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who was religious and still am. And, I had that process for me. I had to work out in real time. And it's part of where this book comes from. So yeah, there's this crazy internal tension. I think everybody feels it at some level, and it's working that out. So one of the ways I tried to work that out was basically just leaving that world completely. I moved to Italy for 3 years. I practically lived like a monk, and I figured out a lot of the stuff that was going on. And then I was able to sort of re-enter the world, so to speak, re-enter, the world of startups. I moved back to Las Vegas, Nevada, where I was before I left, and was able to do it in a way where I was able to sort of live a more integrated life. So it's not one or the other. I think we all sort of live with the tension. Part of it for me was I was an entrepreneur, and there was no model of entrepreneurship that was perfect for me. No one person ever is. So for instance, I was looking for models of, let's just say, holiness. I was looking for certain virtues. Couldn't find them embodied in anybody that was in the ecosystem that I lived in. So I found them outside of the ecosystem, people that weren't entrepreneurs at all. And I became friends with them, and I talked to them, and I was mentored by them. And what ended up happening is that I pieced together relationships. So I think the relationships is what mimetic desire is all about, because the idea is that desire is relational in this very deep sense. And my models came from different places. So I reached outside the boundaries of the ecosystem I was in. I found some models that were outside of it. And then I had a decision to make, well, Luke, what are you going to do? You're going to have 1 foot here and 1 foot in the other place. How do you do this? And then I realized, part of my calling was, no, you've got to figure this out. You've got to figure out a different way to be an entrepreneur that's true to your values. Maybe nobody's quite done it this way before. In fact, probably nobody's done it this way before. But that's kind of the beauty and the excitement of shaping a different kind of career and, making it kind of an amalgamation, this kind of a beautiful tapestry of different influences that might go beyond the kind of ecosystem that you're in.
It's weird, so you're saying people, I guess, have a drive to mimic and then, I guess, therefore conform, but they have elements within them that may be different and individualistic. But you mentioned also being hyper-individualistic, and then also I'm mentioning being conformist. So I don't know, how do you float between those two things? Have you observed yourself becoming more individualistic and then less and more, or in certain situations you're very individualistic and in other ones you're very conformist? What happens to you mentally as you navigate all this stuff?
I think there is kind of a spectrum. And, as we go through life, different seasons of life, obviously when we're kids, when we're babies and adolescents, we're just imitating like crazy, a lot of times without even knowing it. I think that one of the things I've realized is that imitation and innovation are not two totally separate things. Innovation often comes out of imitation, and the same is kind of true with identity. So we have models of desire, we have influences in our life, and they do shape us. And at the same time, our a unique individual self emerges from that. So for me, it's a both and there's something to be said about just being aware of that. I do have, every person becomes sort of this very unique and unrepeatable life by the end of their life. It's why, in funerals, we give eulogies. Everybody is born in a certain time and place with certain circumstances and, have certain relationships and jobs, and our lives that'll never happen again, So we are individuals and unique, and we live these unrepeatable lives. At the same time, they're shaped by all kinds of things, and there's an interplay, and in a way it's very beautiful. I think the trick is to not just become merely kind of a product of your age, and being able to recognize, when is my identity? When are my choices being driven completely by fear, completely by mimesis? How much agency do I have? And there's a dance. I do think that there's a dance involved in the people that we end up becoming at the end.
So what's the goal of your book? Is, I guess, to make people aware of this, but then what do they do with it? Okay, I'm aware. Wonderful. Do I use it if I have a lot of cognitive dissonance in my life and this will help ease it? Like, how do I put your book to work to help myself?
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
I think the book works at a couple of different levels. One is the societal and cultural level. So the book deals with one of the implications of Girard's ideas is that mimetic desire often leads to conflict, even to violence, not just depression and misery if you're sort of, being driven completely by mimetic desire, but even conflict on the societal level because it eventually leads to rivalry. So one of the goals, one of the reasons I wrote the book is actually so that we can begin to have a cultural conversation about rivalries and the mimetic forces that are shaping everything from, politics to the stock market. And being able to see that, being able to see when there's mimetic things happening, can allow us to extract ourselves from them a little bit, to pull back. And Girard talks about the scapegoat mechanism, and mimetic desire is one of the reasons why we engage in the transference of blame. But it's more than we have time to get into on this podcast, I think. But so there's that. There's like, how can we build a better culture, a better world by becoming aware of the kind of human tendency to be rivalrous because of these forces that drive us.
Oh, I was just going to say, I guess it makes sense. Once you're part of a tribe and your identity is wrapped up in that tribe, you're aspiring to get ahead in it. Any other outside influences or other tribes you would see as conflict and against you, you would want to protect your group and its interests because you've spent time and energy and effort trying to be a part of that group. So I guess that would be a source of conflict.
Exactly. So mimesis is a real source of tribalism and conflict because we have certain models that we imitate. And when one comes sort of outside that shared group identity, it's viewed as a threat. So as you get into the second part of the book, this becomes really important. So that's I think it has a lot to say about polarization and division in our country right now. Individual level, it's about self-discovery and awareness and freedom. And, it's funny how many people have read the book and reached out to me saying that they saw the mimesis in their relationships, even with their loved ones or their spouse. So it was kind of a surprise to me. Some people think this is about business or it's a business book, and I do come from a business background, but the vast majority of people that I've heard from so far are not from that world at all. They've just said, yeah, I actually see this in my relationship, in my workplace, and I see how like my husband and I, or my wife and I, for instance, can begin, we both seek respect and sort of a certain amount of just something that we're both looking for. And we end up competing with each other for that very thing. And this is a product of mimetic desire. And the more that the other kind of, wants it and competes with, the more it kind of reinforces this kind of weird competition and rivalry and one-upping each other, and can lead to some bad things. So people are making these connections, which I think is really, really cool.
So what's some feedback I know the book literally just came out, June 1st, but I'm sure you had advanced copies to maybe friends and associates. So have you gotten any feedback that surprised you or delighted you? Like any examples?
That's one of them. Just the amount of people that see this on the micro level, that see it in their relationships, that are able to relate to the stories in the book, even though a lot of them are about business people. It's been cool to see people making the connections to their everyday lives. One that has surprised me, I think one of the things that I wanted the most, and some of the feedback that I've got is there's a whole chapter in the book dedicated to the scapegoat mechanism. And, it's the tendency of people to transfer blame. And this is related very much to mimetic desire, because the scapegoat mechanism is the way that humans kind of bind together against some other. There's a whole chapter in the book dedicated to that. And I've had several people actually tell me that they've realized that they were scapegoating somebody or something or some group, and were able to see for the first time that they were caught up in some mob mentality and hadn't actually had the self-possession to step back and separate themselves and just look at the person as a person, or have a conversation that they need to have. That to me is the most important thing. If one person does that, this whole project would have been worth it.
It's weird. I realized, let's say I live in Chicago, on the west side. I'm part of the United States. I'm a citizen of the United States, so that's one tribe. I'm also in the state of Illinois, which is like another tribe. I'm also living in Chicago, which is another tribe. And then I'm also living in this particular neighborhood, which is yet another one. I have a family, which is another one. I work somewhere, which is another one. So in anyone's life, I would think there's 4 or 5, 6, maybe 8 different tribes that really majorly possibly influence them. Do people even have a sense of this, and how do they juggle it? And what happens when one or more of them come into conflict in a really, head-on way? What do you do?
It's true. We are part of these kind of like interlocking and intersectional tribes. I've found the kind of the positive connotations around tribe building, to be honest with you, a little weird. I'm always a little skeptical of that. I see like courses that like find your tribe, build a tribe. And I've never quite understood that, because in many respects, there's tribes can be limiting, and they can impose constraints, and they can, confine us to ideologies and things like that. So, we're tribal creatures. We still are, even we don't always think of ourselves in that way. At the same time, there's some ambiguity to that. And we have to recognize that, finding a tribe has throughout history provided a lot of advantages to human beings. But it seems like now what a tribe is and what it means is a little different, especially in the digital world that we're all part of, especially with social media. And defining ourselves in that way brings with it some real dangers, including scapegoating those that are not on the inside of it. And, in different tribes come into conflict with one another. I think that we frankly need like a detribalization period. So I'm kind of anti, the notion of tribe. It's not that my family, I guess you could call my family a tribe. But even in that case, it's not that I won't protect my family, but I still want my family to be like open, like I want anybody to be welcome in the home. And I think we just have to define like, well, what does it mean? What are the limits of each of these kind of systems that we're a part of? And how can we prevent it from closing our minds, closing our hearts to people, to ideas? And that's a challenge.
Yeah, I guess last thing I thought of is, now when I think about, after looking at your book, I think about, let's say, Congress. And I think, well, they're their own tribe. That may not be good, because they're supposed to be looking out for everyone else's interest. But given that they're, let's say, a member of Congress and they have their own tribe, that it's worrisome, because you would think, oh, they're obviously going to look out for their own political class, let's say, their own other members. How could they look out for people that literally are strangers to them, but they're supposed to represent?
I live in Washington, D.C. I'm talking to you right now from the middle of D.C. And it's funny, we don't have representation here, and there's politicians that are quite literally a mile and a half down the street from where I'm talking to you, where I'm sitting right now, that are in Congress. And I sometimes I wonder how often they've just walked down the street in my neighborhood and just seen some of the stuff going on. So I think it's got to be encounters, human encounters, and feet on the ground. I think would go a really long ways to reducing kind of the tribal. I think you're right, and I think the only solution for that is to get. I think small is beautiful many times, and I believe in local politics. And I think it's really important, but also just to actually, our Congress people need to have real human contact with the people that they're representing. They can't just stay in the chamber the whole time.
Well, very good. Well, what's the best way for people to learn more from you? The book I would think is what, Amazon and Kindle. I don't know if you've done an Audible version. Where can people go to find out more? Yeah,
so the book is available everywhere online, and hopefully in your local independent bookstore, which I love. There's an Audible version of the book. I read the first part of it, the introduction, and then a pro took over. And if you're interested in just learning more about mimetic desire in general, there was a lot of stuff that didn't make it into the book. And I've read a Substack called Anti-Mimetic, where I publish at least weekly, and it's kind of a nice little intro to the book if you're not ready for the full 280 pages at this point.
Well, very cool. Well, Luke, it was really great to speak to you. I love your interesting perspectives, and I guess I just have to think about all the stuff in this book and what it means, and see how it changes my perception, and I hope listeners will too. So thank you for coming.
I appreciate it, Rich. Thanks so much for having me on.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.